Hello. Today is Monday, May 18th, 2026, and it is race week. Yay! We are in Canada this weekend at the circuit Gilles Villeneuve, and I am very excited. I love the Canadian Grand Prix. I love Montreal. Most of the time, it's a great race. We have had some duds there, but as talked about previously, we've had some absolute insane races too. 2011, 2007, there's always something going on. Last year was a bit boring except for that crazy Lando move attempt on Oscar where he just drove into the back of them and put himself out of the race. Double Mercedes podium, Russell won, Kimi was, second or third? I can't remember. But yeah, always something goes on that weekend, generally speaking. Now today I am going to talk about Canada, sort of, but really I'm talking about the fact that it's a sprint weekend. So I thought I'd do a little bit of a deep dive into how and why we have sprint weekends. And it's a little bit controversial, I guess, because I think the purists are not fans. And that's somewhat at odds with the viewing audience and Formula One, the organisation. So let's talk about how we got sprint races in Formula One. So the big reason is that Liberty Media took over in 2017. Now, they'd actually been talking about doing some kind of change up to the weekend, really messing up the format in order to create some kind of drama and jeopardy. They've been talking about doing that for a long time. But when Liberty Media came in, they believed that the traditional weekends of 3 long practices, a qualifying and a race, there wasn't enough action overall over the course of the weekend to justify people viewing. And, there's a lot to be said for that. A 90-minute practice session, which we used to have, is pretty boring if you're not a mega Formula One nerd. So they really were like, this is not providing a lot of value here. So they wanted something else. Now, it wasn't just Liberty. TV broadcasters, promoters, sponsors, they were all keen, of course, for more people to engage with Formula One, to watch Formula One, see their logos on the cars and blah, blah, blah. So the more people, the more eyeballs, the better for everyone. So back in 2015, prior to Liberty taking over, Charlie Whiting, who was the race director, the now sadly departed Charlie Whiting, explored a whole bunch of ideas, reverse grids and qualifying races, stuff like that. But the teams were dead against it. So move on a few years, Liberty Media comes in, there's not a lot of change, or not any change to the format, until the idea resurfaced again during COVID. Now, while everything was up in the air during COVID, I remember at the time, you probably do too, people were like, well, this is sort of the perfect opportunity to experiment, Everything's been turned on its head anyway, so why don't we try some sprint races, reverse grid races, qualifying races, whatever it is, whatever the option, let's give it a shot because this is kind of a wild season anyway. So as I said, they were coming up with a bunch of wacky ideas. So F2, they of course, one of their races is a reverse grid for the top 10. That was explored. There was the idea of entirely reversing the grid. Championship order reversals. So they would go to the current championship positions and just flip it on its head. There was also random draw grids. Literally picking a number out of a hat and that's where you start your race. But the team that were absolutely dominating at this time, if you remember, Mercedes, absolutely hated this because that would punish them being successful, punish any team, irrespective of the fact that it was Mercedes. That would really harm the integrity by taking away the advantage of the best drivers and the best teams. Now, the teams that were in more challenging positions, like Red Bull at the time, where they had this absolute whiz-kid driver, but in a difficult car, but was able to overtake, they thought, this is an opportunity for us. So Red Bull were more open to it at this period of time. I remember Christian Horner at the time saying, with all the chaos going on, let's just give it a try. He was really gung-ho about the whole thing. However, they didn't bring it in for 2020 during COVID. There was so much going on, I think they were just trying to figure out how they can even stage some Grand Prix that season and how they can make it work, that throwing another ingredient into the mix was just one too many things. But they did bring it in the following year in 2021. Now, because all of those wacky ideas with the reverse grid and the random draw and the championship order thing, that was all a bit much. So, to a certain degree, the sprint concept that they brought in 2021 was a real compromised idea. So the first one they ever held was at the British Grand Prix in 2021 at Silverstone. So this was the initial concept. This is how the weekend ran. So on Friday, they'd have a 60-minute practice. After that, they would have a qualifying. The only qualifying of the weekend. They'd have a Q1, Q2, Q3, and that would set the grid for the sprint. So that's Friday. Then Saturday, they'd start out the day with a practice session. So there's 2 practices. In the second half of Saturday would be the sprint race. Now, it was 100 kilometers. It was about a third of the Grand Prix length, and the race result would set the grid for the Grand Prix. And from Sunday would be a normal day. But the grid would have been set the previous day by the sprint race. Now, the sprint race itself, there would only be points for the top 3 drivers. Now, it's funny, it's only been a few years since that happened, and now I look back on that and I think, what a crazy idea. It was terrible, doomed to failure. And I'm not going to lie, the first ever sprint race at a Grand Prix weekend in 2021 at Silverstone was weird. I remember it distinctly. Because 2 factors, right? Because the sprint race result set the grid for the Grand Prix, if you went off, had a little tangle with someone, and for whatever reason, even if you rode over the curb and busted up your tyre and it messed up your race pace, or you had to do a pit stop, you were not only hurt for this sprint race, but you were at the back of the grid for the Grand Prix. So the cost was enormous. So it ended up being a really cautious race because the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, right? There were only points for the top 3. So anyone outside the top 3, there was no incentive to do anything other than just proceed around the track in the order that you start the race and not in any way pull a move on anyone that was in any way risky. So it was a race, but it wasn't a race. So that format was really quite odd and it just didn't work. So they changed a few things around or whatever, but the big change came in 2023. This is where they completely isolated the sprint race from the Grand Prix, and this made a huge difference. So now, as we know, the weekend format is thus: free practice 1 on the Friday, followed by sprint qualifying, sprint race on the Saturday, first session, and then Grand Prix qualifying on the Saturday in the second session, which qualifies for the Grand Prix on Sunday. Makes so much more sense. So I remember back in another experimental part of the process, there was 2 qualifyings, but they were back to back, and one was for the sprint and one was it was weird. They finally got the schedule of the weekend correct. And this is what we have now, and it's so much better. They also had points down to P8. So it's literally 8 points for P1 down to P8 with 1 point. So really straightforward. So it does incentivize getting points. And as we've seen in recent years where the championship results can be settled, a point here or a point there, the sprint races do actually matter. So there's much more action in sprint races now. Why do some people still hate sprints? Well, I think to a certain degree it had terrible PR initially because the format was whack and the drivers were really cautious. They tweaked it, still wasn't quite right. But the format that we have now, if that was introduced initially, I think there would be a much more positivity towards sprint races from the very vocal Formula One fans. I think the more passive fans, or the fans that don't speak up so much, rather enjoy a sprint weekend. And the proof is in the viewing figures. Formula One, the organisation, and the sponsors, and the promoters, and the broadcasters love sprint weekends because the numbers are always bigger on sprint weekends. Now, it's hard to compare exactly because, for example, this weekend, there is no Canada without a sprint weekend, so we can't compare the two. This weekend is a sprint weekend in Canada. Those are the viewing figures for that weekend. So you can compare it to 2025, but, it's apples and oranges, right, in terms of comparison. The purists, on the other hand, I think they sense there's a bit of artificiality to it. There's not that gradual build over the course of a weekend, building the excitement and building the hype. And I think the argument that they're sort of Mickey Mouse fake races, I think now is no longer the case, right? With last year's championship going down to a few points, and sprint races absolutely contributing to the result of the Formula One season, you can't say they're a waste of time. They absolutely aren't. We do see action in sprint races now, for sure. Maybe it's not quite as white knuckle as it is in a Grand Prix, but I don't know if you'd be able to discern the difference between the start of a sprint race and start of a Grand Prix if you just didn't have any labelling, right? You just saw them. Everyone's still going for spots, right? They're trying to overtake the person, they're trying to defend, they're being aggressive. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I kind of like practice sessions, but I don't like them as much as qualifying, and I don't like them as much as Grand Prix or races in general. So for me, a sprint race, cool, there's 2 qualifyings and there's 2 races. I think I'd take a qualifying and a race over 2 practice sessions. I mean, I would have, absolutely. That's the comparison, right? It's, do you want 2 practices or do you want 2 competitive sessions? That's what we're comparing here. Now, the other argument is that the sprint race compromises the real race because the teams get all the data for the race, so they're much better prepared, and it can be a bit more processional because everyone knows what's going to happen. Fair argument, for sure, but actually everyone learning from the sprint race tends to up their game for the main race, which means that it's actually different. And so everyone kind of moves in this up together, and therefore the competition is equal but often different because they go in different directions and they do things depending on the car. Also, weather conditions change, track conditions change, setups of course change compared to the driving style of the driver, and so you cannot really compare 2 sessions anyway, particularly a day apart. So despite the criticism, when sprints come in, when they were brought in more broadly, and when it's a sprint weekend, TV audiences go up, promoters like them, sponsors like them, there's more social media engagement, and attendance at races, apparently, is higher. So when we had 3 sprint weekends in 2021 and 2022, from 23 onwards, we've had 6. And I've heard Domenicali talking about really bringing in more sprint races, up to potentially like half the calendar being sprint races. Now, does that take away the novelty factor? Maybe, but the numbers speak for themselves, right? This is a numbers and data and analytics sport. So if a sprint race produces greater numbers in terms of the financials than a regular race, you're going to see more sprint races over the course of a season. That is just inevitable. Why wouldn't they do that? Another point here. You have to have sprint races at tracks that make sense. And there's a big point coming up this year. So if it's just a procession, there's no point, for example, having sprint races in Monaco, because it's just a procession. You could argue that the best part of the weekend is qualifying, and if you have a sprint race weekend, there's 2 qualifyings. You double the best part. That's actually a good point. I made a good point to myself there in real time. However, the race is just a procession, so I don't actually see sprint races showing up in Monaco anytime soon, but, maybe that's actually quite a good idea. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you think. But in a sprint weekend, you want to see, the whole point is on-track action, right? Cars racing against each other. That's why it's weird that we have a sprint race this year in Singapore. That is a little bit bizarre to me. Maybe it's the same argument that I just made, that the best part is qualifying and we're double the amount of qualifying. Not double exactly because the sessions are shorter, but we have 2 qualifyings. I think I just answered my own question there. But we don't want a return to the previous sprint races where it's just people aren't willing to take any risks. Because overtaking in a place like Singapore or overtaking in Monaco, you're taking quite a risk with the walls being so close, with the tracks being so narrow. Overtaking is risky business in those places. So are people really going to take a risk in a sprint race knowing that qualifying's coming up in the afternoon and they have to turn around a car if there is a big shunt? That's the other thing. If there's a shunt in a Monaco or in a Singapore, chances are you're taking corners off the car, whereas ending up in a gravel trap, you got to dig all the gravel out, you got to check the floor, blah, 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 but you can almost definitely turn the car around for the Grand Prix qualifying. So there is much bigger risk in a place like a Monaco or a Singapore. So it does beg the question, why are they going to Singapore? Now, the sprint races in Silverstone, except for the first one, the weird one, have always been good. Obviously, in Brazil, they've always been great. I do think it makes a lot of sense in Canada. Shanghai was pretty good. Miami, this year was good. Previous years really did suffer from them learning the car in the sprint, and then the Grand Prix became a complete procession. Like that has definitely been the case in previous years. This year was a bit different just because of all the regulations and stuff. And when the weather played a part in the past, that was really helpful. So anyway, those are the pluses and minuses, the reasons for the sprint races. Essentially, the sprint race wasn't created because there was something fundamentally wrong with Formula One. It was because Liberty Media were really against boring sessions. So they figure, and it has borne out, that more competitive sessions equals better engagement, a higher viewership, and happier sponsors. And that really is the core of the whole thing, and why we probably will see more sprint races. Now, I know that Domenicali wants to bring in more sprint races. I think I remember a quote of him saying that the regulations this year were already a huge change-up. They didn't want to bring them in necessarily for this year, but when the regulations settle down, we may be seeing more sprint races in 27, 28, 29. So expect that to be the case. So yeah, I am excited for Canada. Lots of overtaking opportunities, big braking zones. I don't foresee battery deployment to be such a big deal with these big braking zones. Just depends if the battery has got enough juice in it for that big long back straight. Cars can follow each other a bit better this year. They're a little bit smaller. They can ride the curbs a bit better this year, which has not been talked about an awful lot because we've got rid of the Venturi tunnels, so there's not so much underbody airflow to disrupt if you ride the curbs a bit more. So all in all, and the weather. The weather is a little bit unpredictable. I didn't mention that this weekend. Chances of rain on both Saturday and Sunday was the last thing I saw. So I think we could be in for a pretty exciting weekend. And of course, all the upgrades, and George usually goes well in Canada, so will he bounce back after a couple of disappointing weekends? And of course, all the other stories. Max Verstappen's always a story. I was going to bring up the whole Haas situation with Ocon, but it's all kind of, it's all tabloidy and not really based in anything. But anyway, I will be back again tomorrow to talk about God knows what, probably the news. There's bound to be some news between now and tomorrow. And yes, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you then. Okay, bye-bye for now. I've been your host, Jamie Muffett. You can find me on social media for more of this rambling nonsense under my name or F1_Jamie. This is an RPS audio production.